I have been lurking on this sub a while and enjoy reading people's experiences. And while perusing, I recalled a story of my own from my childhood I had mostly forgotten. My parents divorced when I was 4 or 5 years old, and during and after the divorce, my brother, let's call him Chris, my mom and I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment townhouse. Now this is not the nice townhouse you might imagine, but it wasn't a complete hole either. They were older, maybe built in the 60s, and it was now the 90s, and in a rougher part of town. Something a single mother with 2 kids could swing. The layout of the apartment is important to the story, so bear with me. When you walk in through the front door, on the right is a staircase leading up to our bedrooms, and the kitchen is immediately to your left, where there's a short entrance hallway in front of you. The kitchen has an open countertop area that looks into a dining spot for a table, and there's a split-level living room den area that also had glass sliding doors leading to the backyard, where there was no fence or privacy, and a rather sad and sparse playground. One day after school, my brother and I were out playing in the backyard, when my mum told us she wanted us to go check the mail. The mailbox of the apartments are located at the front entrance, which is on the opposite side of the complex from us, and naturally, me being 5 and Chris 9, my mum didn't want to leave us alone, especially since it was getting dark outside. So we came inside and got ready to leave, and on the way out I remember my mum asking Chris if he had closed and locked the sliding glass door, and he said he had. Cut to when we'd gotten back from the mailroom, and it had been maybe 20 to 30 minutes max. But as soon as my mum unlocked the apartment door, I was lingering in the car for some reason or another, and Chris didn't notice I wasn't in yet, and he was on the stairs when he saw someone's feet disappear at the top of the landing, as if someone were running to hide. Thinking it was me, Chris didn't think anything of it and went to the kitchen, as I then went upstairs directly into our bedroom to get ready for the bath and then bed. My mum was at the table in the dining area near the split-level living area downstairs. Now, as I was completely clueless getting ready for bed in the bathroom, Chris from downstairs kept hearing someone walking around in my mum's room. Now, I had a bad habit when I was this age of going through people's stuff. Not in a malicious way, I was barely 5. It was just curiosity. So Chris, thinking I was just being nosy as usual, ran upstairs to catch me in the act and get me in trouble. He sprinted across the hall to my mum's bedroom and threw himself stomach first onto the bed. But when he looked up, he saw a tall, slender man with a bright green goblin latex Halloween mask on, and he was holding a large knife that he'd swiped from the kitchen. My brother sat there silently in shock as the man in the goblin mask raised one finger to his mouth, indicating for him to be quiet. And in true form for my brother, he screamed bloody murder for our mum. I could hear something going on, but I had no idea what was happening. I had gotten into my big oversized sleep shirt and was on my way downstairs to have a glass of milk before bed. When Chris screamed, the man ran downstairs and encountered my mum, who immediately jumped into action. Our baseball gear was in the living room, and my mum grabbed a bat and started fighting this man as he took swipes at her with the knife. I first noticed what was happening when I came downstairs to the kitchen, pulled up a step stool to reach the counter and to pour a glass of milk, and that's when I could see over the bar. The guy pushed my mum off the steps into the split-level living room, and she landed on her back as she started swinging the bat wildly, trying to make any contact with it, and she did. I was glued to this image, truly frozen in place. Not scared exactly, just so young that I couldn't fully process what was going on. The man finally ran towards the front door, which was right by the kitchen, and I was mid-pour with my glass of milk, frozen, milk continuing to spill out all over the counter and floor. He stopped and turned directly to me, and in that green goblin mask with the knife made a primal, deep sound rage scream of frustration, then slammed the door so hard the whole place shook. I continued standing on my stool pouring milk everywhere, frozen for I don't know how long. Could have been a second but felt a lot longer. And I don't remember what happened after that. but all of the parts I've relayed are very clear to me. Lock your doors. Don't just assume you did. This was nearly a year ago now, on Christmas, when I was at my dad's with some of my siblings. We celebrated Christmas, and then after dinner my dad headed off to be with his girlfriend at her apartment. Left in the house was my 16-year-old uncle, my 16-year-old brother, me who was 15, and the youngest who was a toddler. I woke up early next morning, the day after Christmas, and sat on the floor beside an outlet, scrolling through my tablet. Everyone else was still sleeping, when I heard banging on the back door. I thought it was my dad coming back, but the banging got louder and went on for too long. For lack of a better term, I was disassociated, didn't know what to do, and couldn't move until I heard the back door break in. I had been paranoid about home invasion due to our area in the city before, but I had no idea what to do, and just stood there in shock. I put down my tablet and picked up a nearby flashlight, I think to throw at whoever this was. When the back door had given out, I heard him go quickly through the downstairs, stomp up the stairs, then he was right outside the door of the room I was in. The man opened the door, turned left, then right, where he saw me sitting on the floor beside the outlet, less than 3 feet away from him. He was taller than my dad, and was in completely black clothing and a ski mask. He had a big, rusty-ish crowbar that had a blue handle, and he was wide, looking on the older side. I took a small breath and screamed louder than I have ever before, holding it for at least 20 seconds. Once I'd screamed, he screamed a bit too, then ran downstairs and out of the house. I went to the top of the staircase after he was already at the bottom and out the hallway, when I yelled, "Please leave," as loudly as I had screamed less than a second before. Looking back, asking this guy to leave was pointless, because he already was. But my thoughts weren't very clear at that point. I just wanted him out. My screaming woke up my uncle and my older brother. I wasn't wearing pants, so I put on some quickly, whilst telling my older brother, who was half awake and confused, what had just happened. I ran downstairs and my uncle had just come from his room in the basement, so I quickly told him someone had broken in, but left after I screamed at him. He already had a knife and told me to grab one too, so I did, after making sure the robber had left the house, and checking quickly on the toddler who was somehow still sleeping. My uncle told me to guard the back door and stab anyone who tried to come in, whilst he checked the area outside and around the neighbourhood. I held the knife and stood beside the broken back door, knowing if someone did come back, I wouldn't be able to do anything, let alone stab someone. I've never had a fight in my life. I'm a child holding a kitchen knife. I just held the knife in hopes they wouldn't come back, and they didn't. My uncle came back and said they must have had a driver, as there was no way he could have gotten away that fast on foot. None of us had phones, so my older brother called my dad over Instagram on a tablet to tell him what had happened. When Dad was 10 minutes away via car, he hung up, and while we all sat and waited for him, we talked about the incident, coming to the conclusion that it must have been planned. The invader had come in when there was no car in the driveway, and after entering he ran directly upstairs, ignoring the new Christmas presents and alcohol collection, and even 2 gaming consoles smack dab in the middle of the living room. He went directly for my dad's room, where my older brother and I were. My dad collects valuable shoes, and has some expensive watches that he keeps in his closet, so only someone my dad knows well could have done it, as he knew the right place to go. When my dad came back, he asked me over and over about what the guy looked like, my uncle and him trying their hardest to figure out who it could have been. I was the only one who'd seen the guy, who had been less than 3 feet away from him. I was in direct physical danger from some stranger I'd never met. We didn't call the cops, as the police in our area and city are known for being more than unhelpful. So as Christmas is getting closer again, I'm getting nervous. The time of year taking me back to that terrifying night. I've had a hard time sleeping, and I've been more paranoid. I understand I was, and I'm very, very lucky that I wasn't hurt, and all we got was a broken back door. But I still honestly hate the person who broke in. So to give some context, this story takes place at a campground where myself and others have had strange experiences, but those stories are for another time. When I was around 12 years old, I accompanied my father to our family's long-time campground, where he was going to do some lawn care work before the camping season began later that month. We were probably going to be there for a while, so I asked my dad if I could invite my friend to come with us, to keep me entertained while he finished up mowing. To my delight, my dad agreed and said that he could come, and for privacy I'll be referring to my friend as Dee. Dee and I had been friends for years and had many of the same interests, and among those common interests was our curiosity for the unknown and paranormal. So while my dad was busy mowing, I suggested to Dee that we should try to do some EVP recordings in the cafeteria, just to see if we could capture anything, to which he happily agreed. The cafeteria was a 2-story cement and brick building, with the upstairs being where the kitchen and dining hall were, and the basement, otherwise known as the dungeon, was an old dorm that was being mostly used for storage. It consisted of a very big and dimly lit storage room, a long hall, a smaller storage room, and a rather large bathroom, and the whole atmosphere down there always gave me the creeps. Dee and I made our way into the dining hall, sat down at one of the tables, and we got out my old flip phone and started using the voice recording app to see if we could catch any voices or other unexplained sounds. We took turns asking questions and waiting for responses for about 5 minutes, but to no avail. That is until we heard some noises coming from the dungeon. We discussed going down there to investigate it, but chalked it up to just an animal, since it wasn't very uncommon for animals to get into buildings at this campground. So for the most part, we just brushed it off. We continued with our makeshift EVP session for another 5 minutes, until we heard another noise coming from the dungeon. But this time we both froze in place, looked at each other in shock, and Dee said, "Is that chanting?" At this point we were both freaked out and decided to leave the cafeteria and just go on a walk. As we were walking, we were speculating as to what the sounds we'd heard could have been, and I did my best to come to some logical explanation, as I mean, there was no way there were people down there. We would have seen or heard them beforehand, right? As we continued our walk, we ended up about 60 yards from the backside of the cafeteria, where we could see a door with a window that led into the dungeon. We both looked at the door and didn't see anything weird, so kept walking. But I made the mistake of saying to Dee as a joke, how scary would it be if when we'd looked at the door, we could see someone looking back? Immediately after saying this, we both looked back at the door, fully expecting nothing to be there. But to our horror, something was. Not just something though, there were multiple people. I froze in place, absolutely terrified of what I was seeing. There were 3 people, and they appeared to be in cloaks, 1 in a red cloak and 2 in black on either side, staring directly back at us. One of the scarier parts was that I'd never seen their faces, just the hoods that they were wearing. Before I could even ask Dee if he was seeing what I was seeing, I looked to see him going in full sprint down the road about 50 yards in front of me, so instinctively I started running too, running to tell my dad what we had just heard and seen, to which he pretty much brushed off, but said that he would go and check just to ease our minds. Now my dad is not a man to be messed with. He was a 6'5" cop and almost 300 pounds, so just his sheer size would be enough to intimidate or scare someone off if they were trespassing. My dad checked the dungeon as we watched from a distance, and he came back out saying that everything was fine and he didn't see or hear anyone in there. We were still a little freaked out, but glad that he had said there was nothing to worry about. So we continued with our day until it was time to leave, steering clear of the cafeteria. Flash forward about 8 years, and I had mostly forgotten about the whole thing, when one night my older brother and I, who is older than me by about 7 years, were up late one night sitting on our parents' deck, just reminiscing about the times we had growing up. We eventually got to talking about spooky stuff that had happened, and that brought us to talking about our experiences at the campground. I proceeded to tell him the story about Dee and I seeing the people in cloaks in the dungeon, and my brother then got a very perplexed and somewhat scared look on his face before saying, "You're joking." To which I said, "I'm not. You can ask Dee and he will tell you the same thing." My brother, getting more and more freaked out by the story I was telling him, proceeded to tell me something that has haunted me to this day. When I was about 2 years old, a satanic cult had broken into the campground. They had gone through every dorm in the church, gathered all the Bibles, and taken them to the field which was directly on the other side of the road from where myself and Dee had seen the people in the window. They had burned a massive pentagram into the field, piled all the Bibles in the middle, and set them on fire, and the next day a couple of workers had gone out to the campgrounds to do some regular maintenance and found what they'd done. They called the police, and according to my brother, not only did they find a pile of burnt Bibles inside of this massive pentagram, but they also found the remains of dead animals, all around it in a ritualistic pattern. Nobody had heard or seen anything more about the cult since then, until I told my dad and brother what Dee and I had experienced. Flash forward to today, so 11 years since what we'd seen, and nobody has heard or seen anything else that we know of. So did Dee and I just imagine what we'd experienced, or did we happen to interrupt another cult gathering? After hearing what my brother told me and comparing it to what we saw, I find it hard to believe anything other than the latter. This happened in 2022, and to give you a bit of context, my brother and I had just moved to Los Angeles. He was 17 and I was 18 at the time, and we'd moved to the United States without our parents, seeking a better future coming from an unstable country. We were the only ones with papers, and an acquaintance of our parents, who owned properties in the area, gave us temporary housing in one of the houses he was renovating. It was in a place called Hawthorne, and my brother and I, being innocent and naive, didn't realize that the area wasn't safe. It was common to see homeless people and drug addicts, but we didn't give it much thought. I worked full-time every day to pay our rent and food, and also studied in my free time, so I didn't have much time to relax. My brother, on the other hand, was underage, so he couldn't do much about it. The acquaintance of our parents visited us from time to time and took us out for walks, but it was tough, and at the same time he advised us a lot to look on the bright side of things. One particular day my brother woke me up at 3 a.m, scared, saying he'd heard noises coming from the living room. I, being tired from work and also having to wake up early the next day, told him not to bother me, but he kept insisting, just as I heard something break. Immediately I told my brother to lock the door and I called the police. We were both scared, but I had to appear confident not to scare my brother more. We thought maybe it was Marco, our parents' friend, but that didn't make sense. Why would he be here at 3 a.m? He would have told us he was coming. But then we heard footsteps approaching our room. The officer asked us a lot of questions about our home, how many rooms it had, etc. And then we saw from the window 6 police officers armed with assault rifles. The officer asked us if we had left the door open, and we told her no, and she replied, "It's open." The cops cleared all the rooms and escorted us outside, and after a while they confirmed that there was no one there. After the scare, the officers asked us more questions, and we of course cooperated as much as we could. Then suddenly we heard a woman scream from one of the houses across the street. It was a scream like I had never heard before, of absolute terror. The officers quickly went to check and sent us inside, So we secured everything and I spoke with my brother. He told me that the reason he was awake was because that night his girlfriend had cheated on him with his best friend and he couldn't sleep. An indirect thanks is owed to her as we were able to act quickly and avoid a worse situation, being that my brother was awake. Thanks to that infidelity, my brother and I are still alive and didn't get stabbed while we were sleeping. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, and to this day I always double check if the doors and windows are locked. The next day we found out that that person had stolen from us food, our toaster and a laptop. Then we noticed a dirty and disgusting water bottle on the table. We knew that it belonged to the intruder, and to this day we have no idea who it was or what had happened to that poor lady. But seeing that there were no cops the next day or no crime scene, maybe she probably ran across this guy trying to get into her house, scared him and fled. But who knows? Maybe it was an unlinked situation. Cops never gave us any more details and just told us to be careful. My brother and I are currently happy and a lot safer now that the family is reunited. But we use this incident as a reminder to never let our guards down, and we sometimes laugh about the amount of luck we'd had. Never thought I would be so grateful my brother got cheated on. This story happened 3 years ago, around the time that COVID started. It was early 2020 and I had just gotten a new job in a small town near my area. While looking for a place to live, my sister offered for me to rent her house as she had bought said house 2 years prior, but she and her husband didn't really take to it, and their commute to work was long, so they moved out and the house was uninhabited. Luckily for me, it was actually pretty close to my workplace, around a 40-minute drive, and my sister pretty much rented it to me for free. I just paid for the water and electricity and maintained the property. I was living there for a solid 2 or 3 months and had settled in, when one night after coming back from work and parking my car, I walked towards my door and noticed something odd. There was a cigarette butt on the curb to my house. I leaned down and picked it up, thinking that it might have been mine, as I am a smoker, but after looking at the brand name I realised that it wasn't mine and just threw it away. I didn't think much of it and just shrugged it off as some asshole throwing it at my curb, then went on with my night, nothing else unusual happening. 2 days later I was once again walking to my house when I spotted a few more cigarette butts, this time near my porch. Needless to say, I was pissed off and thought that someone had been sat on my porch and smoked. But since I didn't know who it was, there was nothing I could really do about it. I could see that they'd been put out recently, so whoever it was had probably walked off as I was approaching. That night I was watching a movie on my laptop, and it was pretty late, past 1 a.m, so I was surprised when I heard a car passing by. It's a suburban neighbourhood, and was in the midst of COVID, so people rarely ventured out at night, but I didn't think much of it. Around half an hour later, I was surprised when I heard chattering nearby. I listened intently, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about, as their voices seemed almost muffled. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off my sofa to walk to the front door to make sure that it was locked. However, as I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two approaching my porch and reducing their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that whoever this was wanted to break in. I leaned against my front door and waited, expecting a loud bang or the doorknob being shaken, but it was eerily quiet. I decided to walk over to the window to see if they had walked away or changed their mind. My windows have bars from the inside out that you have to unlock so that you could move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. So I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up, and as I moved the curtains I was taken aback. Leaning up against my window was a man. He became startled and tripped over his own feet as he jumped back. He tightened his hoodie to cover up his face, so all I could really see was his big blue eyes staring at me, his friend realizing that what was going on and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked it a solid 4 or 5 times, but the door wouldn't budge. And all the while I was staring at them, frozen in fear and trying to comprehend the situation. I eventually snapped out of it and slammed the bars over my window, locking them and running upstairs to the storage room, where I pushed a table up against the door and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bars from the windows being shaken aggressively. When they realized that they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, angry scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood, and by the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who it was, but were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't too keen on staying there anymore, so shortly after I moved out. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar has happened again. This happened last night, November 15th, 2023, and it was about 3:30 a.m. I was in my living room, chilling on my couch watching Grown-Ups, when suddenly I heard someone outside fidgeting with my doorknob. My heart literally dropped and I immediately grabbed a knife from my TV drawer that I kept for that exact reason. As the doorknob was still fidgeting, I bolted upstairs, growing more and more terrified, because you could easily break the glass on my door and enter my home. Keep in mind that I live in a low-income area, and I myself is on low income, so there's no security cameras, and I live in a small 2-story loft, so there's not another door to barricade in. My upstairs doesn't have a door, as it's an open area, so I dialed 911. The locks were still making noises as I was on the phone for about 10 minutes, whispering as loudly as I could, whoever this was still trying to break my locks. I could literally hear the sounds in my head, so I don't know if they were actually trying to pick the locks or just trying to scare the hell out of me. Then suddenly I could feel this person trying to push the door, but thankfully it wouldn't open. I couldn't see outside because I was too scared to open the door and open the blinds, and by this point my heart was racing. The operator said that the cops were on their way and to hang up the call, and I began hyperventilating. Finally the fidgeting sound stopped and I stayed put, looking out of the window to see nobody. I couldn't really see at all though, because it was so dark. The cops showed up 20 minutes later and asked me if I was on drugs, but I was completely sober. I'd had a basketball game, so I hadn't partaken in any substances that day. Keep in mind I drink very little when I do, and that's only 3 times a week, but definitely no drugs. I've actually refused to take a sip ever since this incident, because of how much it spooked me, as I feel like I owe it to myself to stay on my toes. Anyway, by this point I was shaking and the cops did a perimeter check, then left, not seeming to care at all. They suggested I didn't stay there that night, and at the next time tried to get a good look at the guy. They said he could have been homeless, thinking that the home was vacant. But how could it be vacant when you can hear Adam Sandler in the background? I was watching a movie in the living room, for goodness sake. Somebody was trying to harm me. It's so scary to think that if I was drunk and I hadn't locked the front door, there would have been a random person roaming around my home. I ended up having a major panic attack when the cops left and I fainted, going into shock. I literally didn't sleep the whole night. And once the sun came up, I went outside, seeing there was trash all over the place because of the local stray cats. I went to pick up all the trash and started to think, could one of those cats have done this? I mean, I've seen videos of cats trying to turn doorknobs, but for 10 minutes. I then thought, could this have been another type of animal? Or maybe it was a crazy person. But what person would raid your trash can and then try to pick your locks? I then started thinking from a paranormal standpoint. But then, the locks. The cops didn't even really check the locks. There was honestly no evidence or sign of any picked locks, just tiny scratches on the wall, but nothing that would indicate the locks had been messed with. It was more like someone had tried to stick a credit card in, but nothing was out of place. Was something or somebody just trying to mess with me as a joke? Not even trying to get in, but just playing a weird-ass mind game with me? Was this some type of visitor from somewhere else? An E.T.? I mean, come on. At this point, I was just paranoid. Someone was trying to get into my home. I'm spending a few days at my mum's house, as I'm so freaked out by this. I haven't slept in more than 46 hours. I'm a relatively happy, lonely 23-year-old guy, I guess you could say, and my mental health isn't the best, but I've never been diagnosed with anything. I mean, what are we talking about here? Do you think it's possible that I've experienced an auditory hallucination? Is there any chance that I actually might be that deranged to where I think someone was actually attempting to break into my home? I usually don't post stuff like this, but I feel like that this is a good place to vent. Maybe someone has encountered the same thing and can help. To preface, I live in a college town with 6 other young girls, and we're all in our 20s. The city we live in is not particularly nice, and has a huge homeless and drug problem, where break-ins are not unusual. However, what happened last Saturday was definitely strange. My roommates and I, as well as some of our boyfriends, were hanging out and drinking in our house, whilst 2 of the girls opted to go out to a bar. By around 1 a.m, the 2 girls came home from the bar and everyone was tired, so we all went to our own respective rooms. Later in the night, I was awoken by someone opening my door and standing in my room staring at me. In my head, I thought that it was one of my roommate's boyfriends, trying to see if my boyfriend and I were still awake to continue to party. So as I was tired, I pretended to be asleep. However, after a while, whoever this was closed my door on their way out and proceeded to pace back and forth in the hallway. They then began to attempt to open my roommate's door, whose room is right next to mine. Luckily, her door was locked, and she also had her boyfriend with her. So then the person proceeded to go through our utensils drawer and grabbed a knife to attempt to pick her lock. After gaining some courage, her boyfriend shouted, "Who the hell is that?" which startled the man, who then sprinted up the stairs and out the door. The police were called and searched the house, but obviously didn't find anything. They told us break-ins were normal, which we knew already. However, what makes this whole scenario creepier is that he didn't steal anything. My phone, alcohol, and $600 shoes were untouched. We also suspect that this person was not on drugs or alcohol, as he moved very quietly and deliberately. He was able to get in because the 2 girls who'd come home from the bar hadn't locked the door behind them. I'm not sure what this man's intent was, but I'm forever grateful that I happened to have my boyfriend with me, which is not often as he lives 3 hours away, and we both pretended to be asleep. It gives me chills thinking that a strange man was in my room, and what could have happened to me if I was alone. On August 29, 2021, Hurricane Ida made landfall in the New Orleans area. Her Category 4 winds uprooted large, mature oak trees, leaving them keeled over in the roads and on the houses as if a giant hand had picked them out the ground like weeds. It was a sight to behold, though this wasn't my first hurricane by any means. The first one I remember hunkering down for was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. I had just turned 10 and lived in Baton Rouge at the time with my family, and although he was a nightmare Category 5, whose sounds I've never been able to forget, he wasn't the scariest. In the years to come, I'd find myself living in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina ravaged our city. Then there was that time in 2008 when I evacuated back home to Baton Rouge for Hurricane Gustav, only to be nearly impaled by a tree branch that flew through my parents' dining room window at 100 miles per hour. 4 years later, Hurricane Ivan ruined long-awaited plans to sit at the chef's table at Commander's Palace, a world-renowned restaurant in New Orleans. Fast forward to 2020, and Hurricane Zeta swooped in just days before the official end to the hurricane season, delaying Halloween in the process and setting an electric pole on fire in front of my house. But 16 years to the day from Hurricane Katrina, Ida pushed in and had something else in store for me. The storm raged in the evening hours, getting stronger as it drew darker. She brought her A-game that night, toppling a massive transmission tower and its power lines into the mighty Mississippi River. Power would be out for days if not weeks, and even months for some. In spite of my desperate pleas to the universe, God, Jesus, anyone, the electricity would be out in our area for 10 grueling days. The heat during the next week and a half was brutal. Record-setting temperatures combined with 100% humidity meant it was literally impossible to cool yourself off. I'm talking about heat that is straight up dangerous. We were fortunate enough to have a small but very loud generator with which we powered our fridge, 2 large fans and a TV so we could keep an eye on the news. We kept it running a few hours at a time to conserve gas, but ran it mostly at night so we could all get some much-needed sleep. My husband and 3 small daughters decided we'd all sleep in the living room so we could all benefit from the blessed breeze the fans provided. The nights were darker than I've ever experienced, aside from the time a tour guide turned off his flashlight in the bowels of a cave in Tennessee. It was pretty damn spooky outside. We live on a busy boulevard, and the double front doors of our house open into the living room, but no one uses the front doors, ever. Before you can get to them, you have to get through an outer set of iron gates, set just 3 feet in front of the doors. I've unlocked and opened them maybe 3 times in the 9 years I've lived here. After a disaster of this magnitude, the city officials declared a curfew to curb any robberies of vacant homes and any other crimes. No one should be out of the house after 9 p.m. or so. On this particular night, my family and I settled in to watch the news and drift off to sleep. I slept on the chaise portion of our L-shaped couch. We kept the front doors open, and the outer iron gates were locked as usual. I had been sleeping in a tank top and just my underwear because, did I mention it was hot as hell? We had all fallen asleep with the TV still on, so it was bright inside the room, relatively speaking. It was 4 a.m. and suddenly my eyes pop open to the smell of fresh cigarette smoke and the deeply unsettling feeling that someone is staring at me. I could hear the blood rushing through my ears as I stared out the door and into the pitch black just beyond them. The horrifying realization that someone was mere feet away, taking drags on their cigarette while watching my young family sleep, was too much to bear. I grabbed the nearby remote and turned the TV off. Now I too was under the cover of darkness. I quietly woke my husband, who also smelled the smoke. By now the voyeur was surely gone, but we will never know when he really left. All we could hear was the roar of the generator outside and the loud humming of fans. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories in this episode. Please let me know what your views are and hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, keep being creepy.